We can hear
Oh,
you
thank God.
now. Welcome. It's so nice to see you. Thank you so much.
No
Have you
problem.
been?
It's been a wild ride.
No kidding, huh? No kidding. All right. I scolded everyone about not wasting your time and being very economical with our questions. So we're going to just get right to it. And I'm going to model the behavior I would like to encourage. Peter, I have a list of questions. I sent them to you before. I'm going to ask you first my 3 questions, 2 of which overlap with everyone else's questions. You've got a lot of people who weren't able to make it at this time, but they're going to watch the video. My first question, I've been wanting to ask you about this for a long time. I want to know what the Zeihan method is. I want to know how your horospecs works.
I wouldn't say it's all that written on. It's this up as we go. But the 2 main guidelines are every possible map we can possibly find to understand why the area works the way it does. And the second piece is to look at the context, its demographic structure in relation to the areas around it to see what they have to work with. Use those 2 things, you'll probably beat a lot of preconceived notions out of your thinking process and start with something fundamentally new that's much closer to the truth.
All right, so let me present to you a country you've never heard before. It's called Zionistan. And I'm hiring you because I want to understand where this country is going. What's the next 5 years look like for Zionistan? What about the next 20? What would you, apart from the maps, and you get to fly there and you get to meet anyone you want, who do you want to speak to most? What do you want to know about its history? What do you want to know about its social structure? I know you want to know about its demography. And what sources do you consider reliable in looking at that?
Well, to be perfectly blunt, I don't want to meet anybody for the first 2/3 of the effort.
Really?
Yeah, because anytime you meet a person, you're going to get the stories of their life, their job, their family, their town. That's not very useful for understanding how an overall culture is going to evolve.
Oh, so I've been doing
You
it
want
wrong my whole life?
Well, you want to see it for what I do. I want to see it in the broader context.
Right.
And then when I have more specific questions, then I'll go hunting for individuals.
Really? That's just the opposite way of the way I do things. Okay. Um, let's move on to other people's questions. I'll consider that a little bit.
Okay.
I was going to ask you though, maybe we can get back to this at the end of the session. If you have a training manual for your new hires, is there an algorithm you go through? But just let that one percolate and let's get to everyone else's.
Oh, well, no, that's easy.
Hmm.
Every possible government base that you can find, take what you know, what you're positive about,
Yeah.
and see how accurate the ones you can find are so we know what we can use in the long term.
Okay.
As a rule, the best ones in the world, the
Mhm.
U.S. Census. They have some excellent,
Yeah, they sure do. They sure do. But what do you do about countries like Zambia?
more of a problem.
Yeah.
That is, once we've done the dig on the demographics and the geography, that's when we have to start talking.
Vivek just said proudly, that's the way I do it. I know, Vivek, and you do very well with that. Okay, let's ask everyone else's questions. You recently said that it's urgent for Ukraine to defeat Russia because otherwise NATO will have to intervene. And because NATO is so much better than the Russian military, we'll clobber them, and then the nukes will start flying. If I, right. I want to know why you think this is the scenario that makes nukes fly as opposed to Ukraine clobbering.
If Ukraine is able to defeat Russia without more than material and intelligence help from the United States, that doesn't actually solve the problem here. The Russians see this as a strategic and a demographic contest in the right. And they feel that if they can't get to the Danube, the Baltic, and the Vistula, that when their demographics turn in a few years, they won't be able to resist any invasion in the future. They're right. If Ukraine were to lose, we then have a fight on NATO territory. But if Ukraine were to win, that doesn't change any of the strategic prerogatives or requirements for the Russians to
Oh, I
survive long
see. The
term.
key there is the fight on NATO territory.
Right.
Um,
But before you get too excited, if Ukraine wins,
mhm.
that doesn't solve the problem either, because Russia still has that same strategic need, and it is going to try and try and try again until it cannot. And the next time it tries, the Ukrainians are going to be forced to take the battle into Russian territory in order to neutralize the logistics hubs that allow the Russians to launch the wars in the first place. that means that the Russians would be theoretically justified in using nukes in a defensive manner.
I think they're going to do that nonetheless. I think they're going to do that this go round.
They're not going to use tactical weapons. That doesn't achieve anything for them.
They're going to try and hit their logistics depots and their
Yeah, but they don't. Tacticals, when it's the country you're trying to occupy, you want to, because you have to deal with it.
well, I wasn't saying Ukraine would nuke it. They don't have nukes.
Oh, you're talking Ukraine? Sorry, I misunderstood.
I'm saying, I think you were saying that next time around, Ukraine will have to go into Russia, which will trigger their strategic doctrine. I think they're going to have to this time.
There's a lot of ifs and then statements in this conversation at this point. It's not clear to me that Ukraine at the moment has the capacity to try that, but the question is whether they're going to be able to do it with something like drones or something with ground troops. Because shy of ground troops, they'll never be able to neutralize those cities. Rostov-on-Don and Belgorod.
Right. All right, let's move on to the next question. I don't want to get too hung up on that. The next question, this is a really interesting question. Given the recent success of the Western alliance in stopping the Iranian barrage on Israel, which included ballistic missiles, although they weren't quite as successful in stopping those, and the woeful state of readiness of both the Russian and Chinese militaries, which you have amply documented, what are the chances that the United States will be largely or totally successful in intercepting a first strike by oddly-based countries, the first nuclear strike, I presume
I'm more hopeful now than I have been in the past. I mean, this is one of those things that you hope data points that are pointing towards a conclusion that's favorable really don't want to test the theory. In the case of what went down in Israel, not one weapon of significance made through, but the Iranians did alert the United States via the Swiss about everything they were planning on doing, so everyone was ready and lined up because they wanted to make sure there wasn't a serious war going to erupt because it was a face-saving measure. I've got a little bit more hope.
Yeah.
I think it's a little more realistic based on what's going on in Ukraine with, say, Kinzhal and the Zyklon missiles, which are being regularly shot down, not even just by the Patriots. And if you can take what are supposed the short time to target capable missiles and remove the existing missile defenses that are in, that's really great. The core issue is, how are we going to get ICBMs?
That's
And
exactly right.
never been able to test that for real. In the case of the United States, our ground interceptors are in Alaska and California.
Mhm.
So those are the ones that intercepts theoretically in space at the and then everything else is theater defense, like Aegis Patriots that are in the terminal phase. So we haven't yet finished in the United States building out that multi-layer system that is kind of the holy grail for what a lot of people would like. And that is still 10 years off. All I can say is that every new report we have about mismanagement in the Chinese system and corruption in the Russian system and verse, it makes me feel a little bit more optimistic.
Right. It was of the weapons they sent that did get through, it was the ballistic missile that got through, right?
I've seen conflicting reports, so I'm honestly not sure. I can tell you that the damage that was done.
Right. Well,
no one was killed. No defense systems were taken off.
Did they really, as you said, tell the Swiss what the path was going to be?
Yeah, I mean, they gave 7 days of advance warning publicly, 3 days of advance warning with the technical information, and then they call up the Swiss the day of, say, just, we've got a couple minor changes to the schedule.
Unbelievable. But they really, were they just testing to see how good?
Okay, so let's back up. Gaza doesn't. I mean, it sounds horrible to say that, but Gaza only matters if you choose to make it. And so for the Israelis, after October, they chose to make it matter for obvious reasons. A lot of people, a lot of countries have now chosen to use the Gaza issue for their own political reasons, Iran being at the top of that list, and so has been needling Israel in any number of ways. And Israel, being a little sensitive right now for understandable reasons, was like, no. And they chopped their hand off with that consulate attack in Damascus, where they killed the top roughly dozen commanders of the IRGC in the Levant. Yeah,
I thought it was 3.
It was they thought it was just the top 2 Israel or have come out and leaked, and that they lost the entire leadership cadre for the region.
Where are you hearing this?
Oh, that's straight from Tehran.
I mean, did they publish it or?
Yes.
And also,
well, it was an Iranian leak that showed up in a French, in France 24, where I read.
where did you learn that the Swiss had provided the flight path and the exact details of everything they were going to send?
Oh, that's context in the U.S. government. Honestly, they were not shy about that.
Really?
So the Iranians lost some high-ranking people, and basically indirectly, very indirectly, approached these like, sorry, we realize that you're a little raw right now. We're having some fun. We took it too far, so we're this face-saving measure so that we can declare success and stop. So they announced to the West indirectly about how all these missiles and artillery rockets, drones were going to come in. They were all shot down. And then the Biden administration is like, okay, so, we got the warning. We shot everything down. Nobody was hurt. This is case closed, right? Looking over it now. Right. And the Israelis sent out one attack, hit the air defense at one base in if
It's fun.
Isfahan. Thank you. Sorry, I only got home at 3 a.m. I'm a little groggy. And that is the closest military facility to the nuclear research facility.
Right.
So Israelis were saying, like, we're not going to escalate this, but we need to be clear that if we feel the need in the future, you now know we can hit what matters to you without help from the United States.
Right. I get it.
They basically both took their hands off the weapons and backed off. And for the moment, it appears that there's no one in the Middle East who wants escalation except for the Russians.
How did they get past the air defenses? Are they using the S-300, the Iranians?
It was S-300s that were taken out.
Yeah, so how did they do it?
Oh, I don't know the technical aspects. I just know that the actual launchers were destroyed.
I know. Great. All right, so I could ask a lot more questions about this, but I want to give everyone else a chance. Next question is, Peter, you are pessimistic on the long term for Europe because of its demography. Do you have any insights into the Baltics in particular? If you were to meet Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, is it Kaja? What would you tell her? And what would you ignore?
Well, the unfortunate situation in the Baltics is while their birth rate may be a little higher than normal, outmigration in the last 15 years has been immense. Over a third of the population of the Baltics has left. Usually those are people under 40. So these three states now exist as economic satellites for the larger states. Estonia in the case of Finland, Latvia in the case of Sweden, and Lithuania is big enough to think it might be able to go on its own, but really it needs Poland. I don't see a way for that to work when you consider that those other countries are having some demographic problems as well. Now, if you consider the Nordic grouping plus Poland as a unit, they are in a situation today roughly where the Germans were in 1990 demographics. So it isn't yet beyond the point of no return. You get some pronatalist policies, you get the birth rate up, but as long as this region, especially the eastern portions, are significantly poorer than the Western European states, you're always going to have that draw. So you have to come up with an economic model where the young people feel that they don't just have a future, where they can do better in Riga than they can in Paris. The only way that you can do that is by industrializing with a series of technologies that is for the West. And that requires capital that these states don't have. So they've got to be able to provide an investment environment for foreigners, whether those foreigners are American or Japanese or German, where money will just pour in droves. And that changes the legal structure and the investment structure to the point that will really piss off the Western Europeans.
Right.
So there's a tension built in here that either these states hollow out as they become fully satellites of countries further west, or they strike out on a new model which complicates the problems of the countries further west. Neither of these are great solutions.
Well, as Vivek and I know, Estonia has been trying to do that by making it super easy to incorporate yourself in Estonia. We're both e-citizens of Estonia for that reason. Exactly.
It's a logical approach. I see why.
Yeah. Since we're on a demographic question, we'll just move a little south. Peter, I understand your demographic argument, and I agree with it numerically. Um, yes, Germany's population is projected to diminish by 80 million by 2050. But its population was 70 million in 1950, and it made out fine for the following decades, even with huge chunks carved out of its young adult population from World War II and middle-aged population carved out by World War I. And yes, I understand this population pyramid will be even more upside down, and the retirees will have to rely more on their savings. But still, there will be 10 millions of working-age adults. What's the source of your opinion that Germany will cease to exist as an industrial nation by
A
then?
couple things come from this. First off, the advantages they had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s is they were still going through the mid levels of industrialization. And when you industrialize, it's not just that you urbanize and your birth rate drops, but you implement a lot of new technologies, especially in healthcare, that allow you to live longer. So in most countries in Europe, between 1950 and 1980, almost all of the population growth wasn't from new births, it was from people living longer. And it's not that that's insignificant, that's very significant, but it only happens once.
Right.
And if your birth rate is dropping that entire time, you have guaranteed that you will never be able to sustain that pattern. So that's the situation the Germans and the Chinese are in right now. Second problem, uh, one-off burst that it got from the absorption of East Germany was just that, a one-off burst, and it probably got another 10 years. And then they got another one-off burst as they absorbed countries or absorbed populations from Central Europe, most notably Balts and Poland. That's also a one-off. And each of these steps bought them time. The next wave of countries over is Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia.
What about the Syrian refugees? Can they just do a few more million Syrian refugees?
Percent of them were men.
Well, that's theoretically a soluble problem, right? I mean, if they want,
Well, you would have to go through all the political issues that they took to bring them in last time in order to get just the women. Leaving aside the training issue and the language issue, when you bring in a group that's 90% male, it doesn't really help the demographic issue. It
no,
might
of
help
course,
your
yeah, yeah,
workforce issue for a little bit,
yeah.
but not your demographic issue.
Yeah,
They've done as good of a job as they can with the tools in play. I'm just saying that there are no longer populations that they can be assimilated in anything less than a decade time frame of age group anymore. Uh, Bringing in 1 million Ukrainians bought them maybe 2 years. But we're at the point now that we would have to bring in 2 million people under age 30 a year every year for the next 20 years just to hold where they are. And if you were to do that, the majority of the population 20 years from now would be so we're in a situation where the complex of the German state now changes. You either go mass immigration, mass training, mass attempts at assimilation on a scale that no European has ever done before in order to change what Germany is and keep the model. Or you keep the cultural model, you no longer have the workforce that's necessary to man it, in which case you go through a deindustrialization process. Keep in mind that during this time, Poland, not only younger, absorbing a lot of Ukrainians, is going the opposite direction, at least for the next 15 years. And so we'll probably see a lot of German industrial pick up and move over to Poland, where it's more viable. And we might even see some reverse migration because of it. Of course, that all depends on the Ukraine war goes.
okay. I'll move on to the next question. The tide of opinion seems to be running against, he wrote globalism, but I think he meant globalization at the present time. Is that baked in for demographic reasons, or is that something that could be changed with enlightened leadership in Washington, unlikely though that seems?
Well, we're at this moment in time where the old rules of the game are breaking down and the system has not formed. Personally, will form before 2045. But in times of shifts like this, you have to look at countries that potentially have agency. And in the case of the United States, it's a food producer and exporter, massive energy producer and exporter, is in the process of expanding its industrial plant. We have industrial construction spending up by a factor of 10 in just the last 5 years. Only about a third of that is because of So America, in its own way, is on the march. And if we were to get a decisive personality who was able to leverage these strengths at a time when everyone else who was dependent on the old system was in trouble, this is how you rewrite the human condition. Now, the United States has been in kind of this suspended moment where it's had this opportunity since 1990. We have yet to have a political leader who's taken advantage of it. So this is one of those things that the brass ring has been hanging right in front of us for a very long time. We've just been in a narcissistic obsession with domestic issues or gulf into the war on terror. So the possibility is absolutely there. I don't think we're going to grab it though, because now we're also going through an internal political transition as our political parties break down. And if you look at American history, if you look at the times when we've gone through similar transitions, a lot has gone on in the world where if the US just had a minor presence, it would have gone a very different way. So, biggest one as far as Europe is concerned is the Great Depression.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
we had gone through one of our political reshufflings at that time, imagine what gone differently with the rise of the previous one would have been our Reconstruction period, where we were obviously obsessed with domestic issues. And in that time, we had the height of the age of empires. If you had added one more player into the mix, a lot of things would have shown a different way, because also the early stages of industrialized warfare. So the potential is absolutely there, but Americans have the political bandwidth to consider it. We would need that singular personality who can reach across the political aisle and lead internationally. I'm unaware of anyone who has expressed an interest in national office who's capable of.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you think it's at least theoretically possible. That is connected to a question. I think it's a similar question. I'll ask both of them at once. One reader asked, Noah Smith's assessment of your book says that the imminent, rapid, and catastrophic reversal of globalization that you predict is unlikely to happen, but that the book functions extremely well as a disaster scenario, a vivid picture of what could happen if the human race allowed globalization to collapse. That's question one. He wants to know what you think about that, but there's a related question. Is the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and Nikki Haley gone forever? Will the Republican Party from now on always be the Donald Trump party, even when he's no longer on the ballot? Could the good Republican Party be brought back to life?
Let me deal with the second one because it's simpler. The Republican Party of Reagan is dead. Trump has driven out all of the people who are business voters or national security voters or fiscal voters from the institution. And last month, when he took over the RNC, he destroyed the capacity of the party to even select candidates that do anything except for work. It's gone. It's not coming. That doesn't mean conservatism, because conservatism is dead in the United States. And in the last month, Mike Pence is talking with Ross Perot about forming a new conservative movement, post-Republican. And Nikki Haley has also joined a think tank to basically attack the same question. So those issues will come, those the moral values, the general structure of thinking of the conservative movement will take a new form, not in time for this election, maybe not in time for the next election. But this isn't the end of conservatism.
Mm.
I will also note the Democratic Party isn't nearly as bad a shape. It's just hasn't collapsed yet. That'll happen in the next 4 or 5 years. This is the sixth time we've done this. It's really awkward. It's really painful. We will get through it.
In
It's
what
just
sense do
really
you mean that
bad timing.
it's
Sorry.
you say that it's in equally bad shape? In what sense?
The coalition that has, so the Republican coalition, historically speaking, at least since for the last 40 years, business voters, national security voters, fiscal voters, those are the core. All three have now been rejected. But there are factions on the left that are going through the same issue. So, for example, the Greens have risen as the economic core of the party, but unions have left in order to get closer to Trump.
Right.
So the Democratic Party used to be a tripartite coalition of minorities, union voters, and coastal intellectual elites. Unions are gone, and the Democrats' hold over the minorities has broken, with Hispanics going their own way as well. It's just that that breakdown has not been as loud and acrimonious because it doesn't have a singular personality touch to it like Trump. but they're also complete mess, and they are also moving around. They will also reform.
Right. All right.
And what was the first one?
The first
Noah
one
someone?
was
Noah
Noah
Smith?
Smith. He wrote a
I'm
review.
not familiar with Noah Smith, so I don't want to like attack his person or anything like that.
Well, no,
But
but what he says is very sensible, actually. He says that he doesn't see the imminent, rapid, and catastrophic reversal of globalization that you do, but that the book functions extremely well as a disaster scenario, a vivid picture of what could happen if the human race allows globalization to collapse. Actually, I don't know what exactly this reader wanted you to say.
oh no, I can comment on that. That's no problem.
Okay.
The two things that most people assume when I talk about the end of globalization is it's just a purely American choice. And that is one aspect, but there's two other things to consider. Number one, maintaining globalization means maintaining security, issue free trade. U.S. Navy no longer has the shape capable of hundreds of destroyers to patrol the global oceans. We have 70. Half of those dedicated to the supercarriers. And as we saw when the Houthis started targeting ships in the Red Sea, it took everything that the Navy had in order to box up the maritime capacity of the world's least competent terrorists. If a real country had done anything at the same time against trade, we would have been helpless. We are already stressed to absolute limit. We no longer have the hardware to keep the lane open. Piece one.
Well, that's because
Piece
we
two.
don't have the right kind of literal ship, isn't it?
Destroyers.
Right.
Corvettes and destroyers, smaller ships that can go more places.
And that could be done much faster than, say, building new supercarriers. So it's
That is true, but you're still talking for the numbers necessary at least 20 years.
20 years?
Well, it doesn't take 20 years to build one of them, but it takes 20 years to build 300 of
Yeah. Well, whenever I look at US government documents, I do not see anywhere we plan to stop patrolling the seas and we plan to stop
them.
guaranteeing.
The open secret is we already have, because patrolling the seas requires a number of ships necessary to patrol the seas. There's 3/4 of the world's oceans where we have a naval presence.
Right.
So that's
Um,
piece one. Even if
mm,
we wanted to continue patrolling, we no longer. Piece two is globalization is built on trade. Trade is built on imports and exports. And half of all of the equations is based on consumption.
okay, so if we're not patrolling the seas anymore, it seems as if globalization hasn't collapsed even without that.
We are on inertia. And with every day that it continues on, we have a little bit more time to prepare for what's next.
But it seems that even without the US patrolling the seas, we can still have global trade.
As long as everyone agrees to never use security issues in their economic affairs, yes.
Right. Mhm. Well, that's a little bit more hopeful, I think, than because it well, I'll let other people ask their questions, and I'll think about that a little bit more. It seems to me, writes one reader, that the West has
Hang on, there was the other half of that.
other half of
Globalization is about trade.
right.
Trade is about imports and exports.
Yeah.
Half of every side of this equation involves consumption. And the demographic bomb means the consumption isn't there anymore. We
Um,
no longer have the population structure of humanity that's necessary to support globalization in the first place.
do we have any evidence though that you can't support that kind of consumption when your population pyramid inverts?
I would say the best thing to look for in the next year or two is how Europeans and the Americans respond to the Chinese dumping everything. Demographic data out of China is so atrocious. They know now consumption-led growth will never happen in the
Right.
PRC. And,
Right.
and so they're trying to dump all their industrial product everywhere else. They're already spawning recriminations. We'll see what that does with policy. But the European Commission, for the first time last week, opened up an anti-dumping effort against the Chinese without a single member state coming. We're probably going to see some pretty robust policies out of both Brussels and Washington this
Okay, we'll start looking for that. Next question is, it seems to me, writes a reader, the West has lived in relative peace and tranquility for so long that it has collectively forgotten how to deal with violent people who haven't. Does this seem true to you? If so, is there a cure for that?
maybe this is just me as an American. I would say instead of saying the West, I'd say Europe. The United States has its issues, but shying away from military conflict isn't one of them.
It seems to be right now. I mean, we have
Yeah, well, we're definitely going through a moment. I, if you had asked that question 3 years ago, I've been very, very, very concerned. Now I see the Europeans really stepping up in a way I wasn't sure culturally or militarily that they were capable of anymore.
and vive la France, huh?
Yeah, and I don't think Macron is talking out of his ass this time.
No, I think he's.
I think we're going to have French troops in Ukraine in the distant future, even this year. Uh, it's a different environment that we're in. Europeans, more or less, collectively have realized that they don't start looking out for some of their own security issues, that it's not so much that the Americans will or won't be there, but the environment that they're in now demands
You think there's going to be a European bomb?
more European bombs.
Capital B bomb.
Well, not under the aegis of EU,
No?
no. But if Ukraine falls, or if the United States backs away, there are those two scenarios. The Swedes, the Finns, the Germans will have a nuke in under a year.
Yeah, that's what I think too. Exactly what I think.
A year would be they felt they needed. They could probably have it at the end of a long.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. All right. Next question, Peter. If you were the president of the United States, how would you handle the conflict among Israel, Palestine, and Iran? Nothing difficult about that one.
Yeah, I would say that situation at the moment has basically compartmentalized itself. The Iranians and the Israelis have both agreed to step back, and so I think we're okay there. For Palestine, if there was a solution to that, that would have happened too. There is no version of this where Palestine, phrase specific, no version of this where Gaza emerges as any kind of long-term crisis. Israel is able to do everything that they hope to do and completely uproot Hamas and take over Gaza directly. And there will be an occupation resistance, and in 20 years, we'll go through this again with whoever emerges out of that. Or Israel fails and Hamas tries this in 5 to 10 years. We have about 3 million people living in open air prison, absolutely no hope of movement or economic development themselves. They will always live on it. And that means they stay in prison. It means that the resentment will never go away. I don't see another option here, except for a taller wall and remote.
Well, they could, for example, stop committing terrorism. That would be the end of the prison.
I'm not suggesting for a second that I endorse or approve anything that happened back in October, but if your sole existence is to eat, aid, and live in a walled prison, of course you're going to.
But that's the wrong causal arrow. They're in the prison because of the terrorism, not vice versa. But wait. I'm
talking about the Palestinian population in Gaza. You've got literally millions of people who were born into this. It's Hamas is the problem.
Yeah.
But how do you prevent the arising of Hamas if the people who are living in the prison?
How do the people in the prison get rid of Hamas? Is that the question?
No. How do you when your entire existence is living in a prison, and there's never going to be any opportunity for you. You can never leave. You can never have a value-added job. There's no investment. There's no agriculture. There's no energy, no manufacturing, nothing.
Mm-hmm.
All you have is anger.
There are people who live like that in many other places, many other countries where the economy is just as bad, and there are equally few opportunities. Let's see. Mauritania?
Can leave.
Yeah, it's true. You can leave, but most people don't.
Agriculture.
Most people don't leave, though. And many.
I'm not suggesting that there aren't parts of the world that aren't ready. What I'm saying is Gaza is unique in its complete and utter lack of options for the population.
And that would not be a problem if they would stop sending Qassam missiles into Israel.
I would argue that Gaza has been more or less in this situation since Sharon built the wall. Before then, there was some limited interaction, not that it was much.
And if the wall is in response to this problem,
We're having a chicken and
okay.
egg conversation
All
here.
right. Yeah, we are. Okay. I will move on to the next question. If you were president of the United States, how would you approach Ukraine and Russia?
I think Biden has hit roughly right. There's obviously a lot of specifics where I would have disagreements, but in the broad scale of things, considering what's at stake, as firm of support as possible, uh, without forcing Russians to consider crossing that nuclear line. I think they're right. That is the consideration. I would probably move a little more aggressively when it comes to weapons transfers and training. But the Germans, despite getting a lot of crap, are broadly correct here. Any weapon system that you transfer to Ukraine, Ukrainians can't maintain themselves. It's just
Right. Right.
and so the idea that we have to train the Ukrainians on maintenance and not just operation, totally legitimate position. The only way you can move beyond that is if you start NATO forces into Ukraine to handle the maintenance directly. And
Right.
that's a escalation. Very few countries that are not bordering the conflict zone directly are ready to take yet. What has changed this year is Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Sweden, Poland now have France on board saying, yeah, we need to. And so the second the French move, they know there's another half a dozen countries that will be moving with them. And that is setting up the stage for the next big debate within the alliance is whether or not this is a step of escalation that we are willing.
What would you do in terms of sending signals that might be understood um, by Putin to mean it won't be so easy by means of a little bit of election interference to get rid of the Americans? I think that's a big issue.
I am a little surprised that the Biden administration has not picked up on something that the Trump administration. Um, in Trump's first year, the NSA basically sent cease and desist orders to the personal addresses of everyone who worked at the Russian bot farm.
Really?
So it's like, we know who these people are. It feels like you could disrupt that to me. Um, but the fear seems to be it would trigger a cyber conflict that the Americans don't want to fight.
Did they cease and desist?
Of course,
So I
no,
just
I'm just saying, if you know where they work and you know where they live,
Mhm.
there are tools in play that are shy of assassination that can
Right.
really muck up that entire system.
Right. I really wish we would use them.
Now, there's a lot going on there that I am not privy to. I am sure there are concerns about escalation in parallel spheres that the Biden team and the Trump team just thought were a step too far.
Mhm.
But yeah, I would personally like to see more, or at least understand more.
What about offering NATO membership to Ukraine?
You
Doing it
never offer NATO membership to a country that has a terrorist active one.
well, as in when what was the name of the conference where the Ukrainians were very upset because they didn't make a concrete plan to admit them when the conflict was over? Um, it seems to me that we could say as soon as this is over, you're going to join NATO.
Yeah, but then you have to define word over.
Mm.
And does over mean pre-war borders? Because that doesn't take you anywhere.
Should we be
Uh,
saying that that is our war goal, pre-war border?
oh, that's been very clearly said that that is the goal. But
Mhm.
saying that if this, then that, without the United States is very big on international commitments that it can enforce. That's probably the biggest difference between us and the Europeans on international. So if you think back to like say the protocol, all the environmental things that come since then, the United States has never signed anything that it didn't think was possible, been under a leftist president. Whereas the Europeans like will sign it for the diplomatic gravitas and then maybe figure out a way to make it work.
Right.
They're a lot more aspirational than we are. We're a lot more security minded and hard line on details. And you're not going to be able to get that sort of commitment because, say, tomorrow, the Russian front collapses, Ukrainians advance to pre-war borders, but there's going to be a lot of churn in Russia. You have to take a very, very deep look, deep conversation with all the allies about whether or not this is something you want to commit to in this form. And pre-committing to it I think it's just going to be a lot of bad blood for everyone.
With all of these questions, I just want to keep asking follow-up questions, but it's not fair to everyone else. We'll have to rush through this, but maybe I'll
Yeah.
send
If
you
you're
an
looking for something where the Western alliance in general, the U.S. specific, can make a really big impact, will really drive home to Putin that this is not going to be easy,
email.
I train up Ukrainians a specific weapon system, easily take out the Kerch Bridge, and then take out the Kerch Bridge.
Yes. Okay. All right.
Now, if you
I'll
do
vote for this.
that, you break Russian power in Crimea,
Of
and we're in a
course.
very different conflict.
Of course. And I don't understand why we haven't done that already. Maybe soon. And that actually, you say that you think Biden has done a pretty good job, but I think he's been way too hesitant here. But I don't know
The
what
stakes
intelligence
are very, and
they
let's
are.
be honest, Ukraine is not a treaty ally.
No, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, all the
It
bases that
really does.
it doesn't matter in terms of the strategic importance of not allowing Russia to ride roughshod over Ukraine and get to NATO's borders.
I hear you. I hear you. But if you go back to like the first day of this war,
Mhm.
I was probably one of the most optimistic people for Ukraine's chances.
Right?
And even I thought this was all over in less than a year. So committing,
Mhm.
heavily committing to a Russian defeat is still not the smart money. It's not that it's not necessary, it's very necessary. But the difficulty here, even Ukraine has a great day, or like they have the Kharkov offensive, Kherson offensive, there's huge successes. They need to do that 40 more times to win.
Did you say 14 or 40?
4-0. Amount of territory in question here has to be reclaimed is immense.
At some point, though, you imagine that if they do it 7 or 8 times, the Russian army collapses, right? They give up?
Maybe. I
Yeah.
mean, the Russian military and the Russian morale and the Russian population are unstoppable until the day they change their mind.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, all right, we'll move on to the next question, and maybe we'll come back to that one if we've got a little time at the end. You said that China is finished if the U.S. withdraws its navy from being the world guarantor of freedom of the seas. What's to stop the Chinese from developing their own blue water navy to replace the U.S., at least for their own and like-minded authoritarian regimes?
Technology and experience. Technology is something that's probably the smallest of the problems for basing. If they had the perfect technology now for everything that they need, then there's the issue of timing. The current rate of naval build out, they won't be equivalent to the US Navy until roughly 2300.
2,300.
2300.
Really?
They have a lot of ships, but almost none of them have range. Third, basing. The United States basically controlled all the best ports around the world in terms of
Yeah,
basing. China doesn't have a single one outside of Djibouti, which is only possible because of assistance from the United States and refueling so that their navy can get to Djibouti. Let's that's not call that a strategic asset. That's a strategic
yeah.
drain. Uh, and remember that China is an export power. So the United States can maintain global hegemony because it doesn't care about the trade. If China does, so China not only has to have a presence globally that's bigger than the United States, it has to punch out of the first island chain, and then it has to have a naval force that protects all the sea lanes for its own commerce. That requires something at least 4 or 5 times the States has. So now you're talking 27. And at the end of the day, you don't need a big navy to disrupt trade. So if the United States decided it wanted to play the spoiler, this is a country that imports 80% of its energy, percent of that's from the Persian Gulf, and they import 80% of the stuff they use to grow their own.
Right.
Breaking China is child's play if it comes to.
I don't know much about shipbuilding, so this might be a stupid question, but why does it take so long to build them?
You can build one quickly, you know what you're doing, modular technology, right? Korean are the only ones who probably build vessels about 3 times the space in the United States. The second problem is that this expertise is something that if you day in, day fades, it just goes away. Same with kind of nuclear civilian technology. So in the case of the United States, we made the decision back under Clinton, the world was safe, history was over. So
Mm.
let's retool our Navy so that we have the hammers necessary to take out the rogue states, Serbia, Iraq, Korea. And in doing so, we stopped building the smaller vessels.
Right.
And so we now have to retrain a force to build the smaller vessels. As Koreans, yes, they can build them faster, but they've never built a warship that has actually seen war.
Gotcha.
Neither the Chinese for that.
Yeah.
So we build super carriers,
Mhm.
and they're great. They're not enough for that type of operation.
Yeah. I got it. I got it. That seems like a convincing answer. How likely, writes a reader, is Putin to test a tactical nuclear weapon in non-national space, for example, mid-ocean, just to panic European polities and populations and encourage them to sue for peace at any price? If he
I,
did that, is there any downside for him?
I don't see what that would achieve, except for making the Chinese have to publicly side against Russia.
Well, getting Europeans to sue for peace at any price.
I don't think that would happen. I mean,
You
I
don't
think
think
the
so?
Europeans have broadly assimilated the Russians are not nice, and that nukes are now part of the conversation that has to be addressed. I think all that would do is convince people who have been on the fence that the military industrial build out that Europe started has to
Right.
accelerate.
Right. So, do you think Russia's entire escalate to de-escalate strategy is based on a misunderstanding of Western psychology?
Well, the Russians, they're a little bit like Italian pasta makers. They throw it against the wall, they see what sticks. They're not committed to any particular line of bullshit. They will just keep trying and trying and trying. They're doing that on the United States too. It's like, so Major Tyler Green, who is probably one of the 20 dumbest people in America, is now all of a sudden the cause celebrating Russia because their handler, I don't know if it's for her personally, for someone on her staff, someone near her, their handler got Russian propaganda from 15 years ago into those amendments that she tried to put on the Ukraine bill.
I just
Like,
wrote about that. I just
oh,
wrote about
really?
Yeah,
I mean, that was just, I was like, oh my God, what a great tell.
I know. I know. I mean, Transcarpathia? It's like,
I know,
hold on.
I know a lot about the former Soviet Union. I've been doing this a while, and I think I've only heard that term like 3 times.
I think we have to understand what the mechanism is here. And we've got a big problem with
But we now have members of the Freedom Caucus,
mm,
that faction that is broadly opposed to anything,
you're preaching to the choir
being
here.
MTG, Moscow Majory.
Mhm.
And so we're seeing, from my point of view, kind of a break in the law of Congress that reminds me a lot of about 1937 to 1939 in the United States, when we had a lot of Nazi propaganda turning factions in the American Congress until they overreached. It feels like we're at that moment now.
We are. It's unbelievable, uncanny how much it echoes that moment, down to the language, the same personality, the same figures. You're preaching to the choir on that one. All right. Um, Next question is, okay, this is a kind of a complicated question. Um, let's assume you're 100% correct in your demographic predictions, and also and also about the economic and strategic consequences of the demographic treadmill to oblivion. You argue that in approximately 20 years, when the millennials' children enter the workforce, we, especially the United States, emerge on the other side more energized. We've got past all the woes that we have to endure for the next 5, 10, 20 years. But, he says, your forecast affects both the numerator and denominator of each seemingly intractable problem. I'm not exactly sure what he means by this. Not simply one or the other, which seems to make for the mother of all deflationary cycles 20 years and more from now. Will we rebound from a crushing cycle of inflation to an enduring bout of deflation? Excess capacity everywhere will serve a smaller demand from a smaller populace. What am I missing? And he's actually here with us in case I have
That was a
misrepresented.
great batch of stuff. Okay, let's first talk about
Mhm.
the countries that have millennials: New Zealand,
Mhm.
Sweden, France, United States. The only 4 countries this applies to.
Mhm.
There are not sufficient millennials born in anywhere else in the Western world or East Asia to do what we're describing here. So we have a very limited back. Great for those countries, bad for everyone else. Second, the reason that I'm not convinced that deflation is where we're going is deflation assumes that there are no breaks in trade connections. It assumes that all the production capacity that has been built over the last half century remains fully operational, and that the output from that industrial can reach wherever it needs to go. I think it's more likely we're going to have a breaking of trade lines, and so a lot of this spare capacity gets stranded. So you will definitely have pockets of extreme deflation where that happens. But since in manufactured products specifically, so much of the supply chain crosses state lines, it is more likely, I think, that when you break those connections, you'll have inflation in the finished goods because the various inputs can no longer come together. The big trade bloc that survives this transition, the less true that is. So the North American network might have inflation on the front end, to say, for example, the Chinese collapse ahead of schedule, if that's the right phrase, and build out the industrial plant. But then as we build out the industrial plant, we go from inflation to disinflation as it comes on the line.
Yeah.
But in Europe, where more of the supply chain is in the same network, but the demographic story is bad, that is probably more like classical deflation. Unless you're in Poland, where they're trying to build out to replace the Germans, and then you can have something similar going on in North America. In China, in places where the supply chain is held within China, it's not dependent on imports, definitely deflation there. But as they lose the raw commodities, you have energy-based inflation and cultural-based inflation, which is another word for famine.
Right.
So all of that
Can I ask
will
you a question?
happen in different places in different markets. Don't want to be a bond trader.
Uh, it was your question, wasn't it, David? You, did I ask it correctly? Was that the question you were getting at?
Yes. Thank you, Peter.
David, I want your eye patch.
All right.
I'll send it to you.
Oh, that would be nice of you. Moving right along. How likely is Iran to attack the U.S., either at home or abroad? Well, it's 100% likely to attack abroad. It does it every week. If they were to attack, how do you think they'd do it?
I'm sorry, you broke up a little.
I'm
I
sorry.
missed the noun. Who are we
Our reader
attacking?
wants to know how likely Iran is to attack the United States, either, and she said either at home or abroad. And I interjected, well, 100% likely to attack abroad because their proxies do this about every 48 hours. But perhaps
I would argue that Iran doesn't have the technical capacity to strike the North American heartland. The Iranians, in the moment, at this moment, the Iranians have no desire for any sort of meaningful conflict with the United States. Otherwise, the situation with Israel would have gone very well. That whole thing was as much for assuaging American stress as it was for Israeli stress. So I don't mean to suggest we're about to have time right now. At the moment, pretty clear to me that Tehran is not looking for escalation.
why
They
do you
will
say they don't
still
have
take pot
technical,
shots at military assets throughout the Middle East.
why do you say they don't have the technical capacity? It seems you just need to get someone over the border with,
Oh, you mean like doing a terror attack? I was thinking about
yeah.
this. I think the Iranians, number one, are savvy enough to know that that'll blow up in their face. Look at what we did after 9/11. The United States, if the Iranians were to do homeland style attack of any sort of scale, I'm not talking about like the equivalent of a school shooting here. I'm talking about like a mass casualty event. Uh, Definitely put a couple of carriers in the area. We would definitely destroy every nuclear facility we have. We would definitely take their energy system offline in a way that would leave it offline for at least 40 years. We would definitely wreck Tehran. We would probably not do a ground invasion because, dear God, a ground invasion of a country, I would like to think we learned our lesson in Afghanistan, and Iran would be much, much harder. But that doesn't mean we cripple the country for a generation or more.
Sure. Who would you read if you wanted to understand the technical problems involved in taking out their nuclear facilities?
I don't have a good answer for you that because I can't remember.
Right.
There have been a number of studies by think tanks. I don't want to start naming them though, because I'll probably get the list wrong. But that's a place to start. Places like the CSIS and ISIS.
Off the top of your head, doable, not doable?
Well, I don't want to say it's doable or not doable because the nuclear program isn't active.
Mhm.
It's not building nuclear weapons. It's still in the research and the enrichment phase. And if you want to take out all of the pieces that, we're talking about 50 different sites. So taking it all out just isn't possible, but taking out enough of it that it knocks them back 40 years,
Right.
totally. The most expensive, the most technically complicated part of it has the centrifuges and getting the enrichment up above percent, which they've never demonstrated capacity for. And if you remember Stuxnet, that was designed to basically wreck the centrifuge. That was a very smart program. But honestly, the best way you can do this is by taking technical staff. A lot easier to do than going after a lot of these facilities. So if we decide that's what we hit, Americans love the big rah-rah bombing campaign. Honestly, a couple of busboys with a silencer are probably going to be a more effective strategy.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. But how many competent nuclear physicists do they have?
Probably no more than a couple of dozen.
Right.
Their science isn't exactly easy. And even if you can build an explosive device, you then have to miniaturize it down so you can put it on a weapon. So there's a number of places where a lot of technical skill is required. You can insert yourself in them, and you don't technically destroy the program. You make it non-functional until they rebuild that capacity. It's to this point, it's taken them 40 years.
Well, they probably are making a deliberate decision to be a threshold state, right?
That is possible, and maybe even likely.
Yeah.
But it's not, if that is your goal, not like if you've given the order that in 6 months you'll have a bomb. It just means you've hit a technical point, decided to stall, but the only way you can pass that technical point is due to a lot of testing of explosives, miniaturization, and that requires some launches. And so you won't know how close you are until you try to take the next step. So I'm reading between the lines here because we've been having this conversation about around 30 years now. If you listen to some of the folks who speak from behind the curtain, they have been 6 months away for 25 years. I think it's far more likely that they can't do it.
Why would it be so hard to do it if they've got this far?
Because getting from percent to 90% enrichment is very, very difficult from it, and they've never gotten percent. So they haven't even gotten, from my point of view, to the hard part. Second, miniaturizing a uranium bomb to a large missile is almost impossible. That's why we use plutonium. They don't have sufficient plutonium capacity in order to make a plutonium, so they can't test the explosive capacity for an implosion. If they did have that, then you have to worry about the shielding, the shock absorbing to put it on a missile so the thing doesn't shake apart when you're launching it. Those are 3 big steps that require a lot of technical skill, that the only way you can find out if you've done it right is to test it, and the testing is loud.
Right. I mean, would the North Koreans help them with the technical?
That would be the point in my logic, that someone from the outside that has already shown how to do it just comes in and does it for them or gives them the equipment, and that basically described the Pakistani nuclear program.
Right, right. And I think Russia owes them a favor at this point too, right? Although I don't
Russians have given them a satellite so that they can get real-time information to improve their weapon systems.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the Russians clearly have a nuclear arsenal and nuclear expertise to get. One thing to keep in mind, the Russians know how to.
Yeah.
The Russian technical education system collapsed back in '86. So
Right.
their nuclear scientists who know, they're in the mid-60s.
How many of them do you think there are?
Probably about 100. But that's one of those things that's closely held secret. And for a lot of them, they've had real opportunities, things in places for a long time.
Right. It's like that question they supposedly asked people at McKinsey, how many piano tuners are there in Chicago? All right, next question. Oh, this is a good one. With China and Russia taking so much of the bandwidth, how do you see things playing out in Africa in the medium to long term? Especially if you could say a few words about what's going on in Sudan, because I find it extraordinary that this catastrophe is being completely overlooked by the rest of the world.
The sad part is we're probably going to have a lot more Sudans, just in Africa.
Yeah.
African story since independence has been one of a neo-colonial relationship, because you've weak institutions, relatively ossified political systems, and for the most part, just resource plays. Part of that is a policy issue in the West. More has to do with the geography. Africa is basically a series of 5 uneven stacked plateaus. So getting any sort of meaningful infrastructure in there, especially if you're looking for an infrastructure that will use, as opposed to just be tap lines, is almost impossible. There are a handful of places where there are exceptions to that, where there's a coastal plain or access to the interior from the coast, where you can actually build out a regional infrastructure. Senegal, Nigeria, Angola, South Africa, and the Kenya.
Yeah.
Those are places that, as globalization breaks down, are going to be the regional powers that can actually do something and probably interface with the outside world from a position of at least a little bit of strength. Outside of those zones, some version of Sudan is probably what we're looking at here. 2 problems. Number 1, Africa has partially industrialized their agricultural system. None of the inputs for that system come from the. So all of the challenges that I see for the Middle East in general, or China in general, when it comes to maintaining agriculture, also apply to Africa. And so we're going to have probably a significant food crisis across. Number 2, those regional powers are going to have something that outside powers want: access and stability. And that means they're going to demand, almost Russian style, a free hand in shaping their own neighborhood. That's great for them, but maybe not so great for the neighborhood.
Well, they are demanding not just Russian style, but Russia.
That will only last as long as Russia is capable. I don't think that's a long-term issue. You can understand it doesn't take a real reach to figure out how they want to play both sides. But when it becomes apparent that that side is not an option, they will turn to the other options. It's just that this is not the 1860s, when the Europeans had guns and the Africans had spears and there was no contest. They both have guns now. And while one may be more industrialized than the other, competing on the same field, even if it's not level. And so if the French, say, want to go back into a place like Senegal, they can't just walk in and take over. They have to cut a deal. And so there's a negotiation, not among equals, but certainly among peers.
Yeah. From my last experience in Senegal, I don't think they would welcome the French back under any circumstances, but
And the Brits, fine. Some, it's like
The
they
Russians-
know partnership with the outside. The outside powers know there's things that the Africans have to offer that they want. There's a basis for a conversation. It doesn't have to be friendly for it to not be war.
Yeah. If you were looking at Sudan, what would you do if you wanted to try and solve that problem? Is it soluble in any way, or are 8 million people going to starve?
It's probably going to be more.
And there's no,
Sudan's limited contact with the outside world in the globalized era with its oil, that's now offline. And between Sudan proper and South Sudan, we have an area that's decivilizing. If you can't grow enough food to feed your population, and you can't export some sort of product that allows you to buy food, there's only one other way this goes.
but this was triggered by 2 warlords deciding that they were going to, for no reason anyone can discern, have a fight.
Well,
But
the reason was each of them wanted to be in charge of the dirt.
yeah.
And
But you think the
the reason
underlying
that fight is happening is because there's not enough resources on the dirt for both of them. We're going to see a lot of this. This
Does
is coming
anyone-
to Central Asia too, by the way.
does anyone think that that is a challengeable proposition, or feel that there's some reason to be more hopeful? That's a pretty horrible thought. All right. Let me make sure. We talked about the Baltics, we talked about Iran, we talked about this is a really interesting question. Given your assertion that the United States will need tens of millions of workers in the coming decades to reindustrialize, do you believe that the current administration's neglect of the influx of over 7 million illegals, maybe not the best and brightest, but certainly the most energetic and enterprising citizens of their respective countries, is deliberate and perhaps even justified? Because I sure do.
Two pieces to this. Let's start with the political. We're not going to have meaningful immigration reform in the United States in the next few years. The two factions in the United States currently not really in either political coalition, but have a lot of voters. And so both the Democrats and the Republicans who attract them are Hispanics and the unions. Those are the two factions in the United States that are most opposed to immigration in all its forms. And so no one in the White House or Congress wants to breathe about immigration reform until they know where those two factions are going to land on the political spectrum. So until we work out our other political shit, we can't talk about immigration in a constructive, unfortunately.
Right.
That's piece one, not the politics, the economics. Leaving rule of law aside, leaving security aside, just putting on my economic. If it wasn't for the 2 million people who crossed the border last year, we would already have inflation of 9 to 12%.
Exactly.
They are one of the few things arguing for keeping our inflation rate on.
Exactly.
Thank God.
Exactly. That's my thought exactly.
Unfortunately, both of these things are true at the same time.
So he's asking, do you think this is deliberate? Do you think the Biden administration is aware of this, and this is why it is choosing not to enforce the
talking about whether Biden is aware of something feels like a trap, so I'm going to defer on that part of the question.
The administration, put it that way.
I think the Biden administration is hyper aware of the first part of the equation, the political side. And Biden has lived through 2 of these previous political reshufflings. I think he's aware we're in another one. And he considers the unions a core part of the Democratic alliance. And the fact that talking or voting there has him personally upset. And he doesn't want to do anything that will drive them hands of Trump. So if that means taking a less than fully economically viable position on immigration, so be it.
It'd be very interesting, maybe one day when the archives are open, to know whether this is actually a deliberate spoken policy. Let them come because we need them economically.
Well, Trump barred all legal migration in the United States. Biden codified that. If you're going to immigrate to the United States, it doesn't matter who you are. The way you come in is across the border.
Yeah. Apart from the waivers he's given to Venezuelans and Haitians, and it's just.
Well, the numbers for Haitians is very small. The number for Venezuelans is more significant. But keep in mind that Venezuelan labor was skilled.
Right. Well, we need all of these people, in my view. We're the only country in the OECD that has a buoyant economy, and that's in large part because of all these people who everyone says they don't want there.
I would love to be able to change the conversation around that, but this is not a new problem. Our last immigration reform.
Well, the conversation about it is just so stupid. And this is another really good question. Why has there been, and perhaps you've already answered it, but he asked, why has there been such a, he or perhaps she, I'm not sure. Why has there been such a dramatic change in Iranian strategy? Why have they decided that they're suddenly going to, I assume he means, why did they suddenly decide that it's time to strike directly at Israeli territory? And why did they do this when their proxy strategy was working so well for them? They had Israel exactly where they wanted them. Israel was in international disgrace, becoming a pariah. The Saudis.
I think there's a misunderstanding here. My general position is that Iran, with taking advantage of the Gaza situation for political and PR purposes, was needling, and then got its fingers cut off. And like, oh, for us, this was just a side job. This was just fun. So we're going to do this pro forma attack to save face and then dial it back. I think they definitely keep up with the proxy stuff.
Second part of the question was, does it represent a shift in who controls the regime's foreign policy?
No.
Or does it represent shifting? Okay.
No, I think they just decided to poke Israel a little bit more aggressively and got ahead of themselves and got slapped down, and we're back to now where we were before.
I don't know who asked that question, but if I missed some part of it that you wanted me to ask, if that wasn't exactly what you wanted to know, you can just raise your hand. No? Good. I think we may have gone through all of the written questions If I missed your question, put your hand up. Oh, another one. I was horrified at the consequences of the Jones Act described in one of your recent updates. Do you believe there's any chance of repealing that obsolete and destructive regulation?
The faction that's most in favor of the Jones Act are the unions, and so not until we get on the other side of this political reshuffle.
I missed your update. What's the relationship of the Jones Act and the bridge?
So the Jones Act was something that was back in the 20s that makes it illegal to ship any cargo between two American ports unless it's on a vessel that was built in America, owned by an American, financed by an American, crewed by Americans, and captained by Americans. And we don't do that to any other transport mode. And so basically, since the Jones Act was adopted, the value of traffic in inflation-adjusted terms on our waterways have dropped by 90%. Moving things by water is by far the most economical way to do it. The states that have lost the most because of this are in the Rust Belt. One of the reasons why the Rust Belt is the Rust Belt, but it's also taken a big hit on the southern states. And until such time as this is amended to make it on par with other transport methods, it's a real drag on American growth. If we were to liberalize the Jones Act, no doubt that we would add a couple of percentage points to annual GDP growth for at least the next half century.
Okay. All right. Arun, you've written that Peter is completely wrong about the unions.
Be more specific.
You're muted. Arun? All right, while you're sorting that out, Vivek, you have two questions.
Yeah, sorry. No, I just wrote in. The unions in the United States are not opposed to immigration reform at all. I mean, well, they're for immigration for reform, but I just made that comment. I was very surprised.
I'm not quite sure what to say
That's
because
all.
it's like a leading policy plank for all of them. They want a sealed border. They don't want to bring in skilled labor. They
I
want
think you're
trade
confusing
deals that
immigration and
unionize on
trade.
the other side to raise prices.
Which unions? I
am unaware of any that has a pro-immigration or pro-immigration reform policy.
Well, it depends on what you mean by pro-immigration. I mean, we're talking about immigration reform, like, when you talk about legalizing, the Dreamers, the DACA, and all of that, which is the core of the Democratic Party position. The unions are not. They're entirely on board with that. They
DACA,
We
yeah,
heard
I
this.
have been for
DACA
50
a normal
years.
immigration
The
issue.
unions changed their position on immigration. Well, some of them evolved with 1965 and the 1965 reform. That's all.
I think we're talking past one another here, or maybe on different subtopics.
All right, we'll leave this one be, and we'll come back to it later. Vivek, you have two questions.
Thanks, Claire. I put them in a direct message to you about things.
You can just ask them yourself.
No, please. Thank you.
Message for me? One.
Yeah, it's a direct message.
Oh, great. That's from Jay, and that's from Arun, and I don't see it. So why don't you just go ahead and ask?
Okay, this is a bit different from the other questions that you've been asked, Peter.
Mhm.
The way I'm looking at it is China's now increasingly geoeconomically involved with the Middle East. It's not just Iran, it's about the FDI and the BRI. Across the region, especially in the last 2 years, there's been much happening on that front, a lot of visits back and forth, lots of conferences. I've been tracking some of those. They're not much involved in Iran, I mean, except for their oil purchases and perhaps some other commodities. And again, the trade corridors are realistically about half a decade, if not more, away. So what's next for China geopolitically in the Middle East? More so, given the phase that the conflict is at?
Let's start with the obvious. No one has fun in the Middle East. And so it's really easy to undercut whoever you might consider the local regional hegemon. Not hard. Number two, the BRI has been a spectacular failure. One, it's been primarily an avenue for capital flight for corrupt officials in China. You see the Chinese spending like $8 billion for a $2 billion asset. That's not an investment. That's capital flight. And during COVID, the Chinese shot themselves in the foot. One of the fun things about when you pay people to be your friends, you stop paying people, they're no longer your friends. So during COVID, the Chinese went out to all the people they had lent RI money to and said, by the way, none of these were grants. They were all loans, and now you got to pay us back. And only 2 countries are actually making an honest effort to pay them back. One is Pakistan, who for strategic reasons doesn't have a choice. The other one was Sri Lanka, which then had its government collapse in part because of debt. The Kenyans, in my opinion, had the best response. When the ambassador delivered this message, the Kenyan team just started laughing and didn't stop laughing until the Chinese ambassador left the room. So they basically burned $1 trillion to buy friends for a certain amount of time, and now none of those countries are friends anymore.
Where'd you hear that?
The Kenyans.
Can you?
Yeah. So it's not that the Chinese don't have tools. It's just that money only gets you so far. And the Chinese don't have the ability to shape the security environment in the region, which limits how much they can do unless they just want to write a check. And as people who have written checks every week in Afghanistan for 20 years, the Americans are very clear on the lesson of it's like, and what does the winner get? So, yes, they buy the oil from Iran. As long as the Americans are still not providing security at the seas, you might as well.
Right.
But Iran, even at their best, never exported more than 3.5 million barrels a day. Now they're down to about 1 million. The smart money isn't with Iran if you're looking for a long-term economic relationship or energy security. It's with Saudi Arabia. That's where we focus. I would argue the most effective policies when it comes to forward investment in the world that the Chinese have, it's with the Saudis in terms of building refineries in both Saudi Arabia and in China that use a blend of crudes that's primarily Saudi in order to attempt to build anyway, the long-term sort of relationship with Saudi Arabia the Americans had until recently. Because the Saudis and the Americans did the same thing back in the 60s and the 70s, but then the shale revolution came along and the Americans just stopped buying.
Why is China so determined to have a bad relationship with us? It seems it would make much more sense to have a good relationship with us.
Well, we can have a long, drawn-out conversations of the pros and cons of a bilateral cooperation. But the bottom line is China is capable of that. The cult of personality there is now so strict, it's just one dude.
You
And as
keep
long as
saying
that is the
yeah.
case, we shouldn't expect to have normal. Chinese should not expect to have normal. No one should accept the Chinese to have normal relations with anyone because it's no longer about security or economics. It's about your access to that one person and how that one person perceives you.
I don't see much reporting about this. You've said it repeatedly, and it's very striking. There's only one dude, and everyone else has been purged, is terrified, and doesn't even bring him good information. They just don't speak to him. Are you getting this from government contacts?
I don't know anyone who has had conversation with anyone at the Politburo level or this level down in the last 5 years who has discovered anyone with autonomy in it. People talk about folks that they've met as far back as watch them rise through the ranks and be minister of that or mayor of that. As of about 5 years, the purge reached the point that there's no one within reach for echelons that has any authority at all. After the third party Congress that Xi ruled over, he basically purged the last factions. Everyone he elevated were people who either were incompetent or silent or more like both.
So you're deducing from this that this is what's going on, or do you know people who are trying to find conversations to eavesdrop on, and they're saying there's just nothing there?
I know that too.
Right. Okay. I find it remarkable. I mean, it would really be nice to see some reporting on this. Where are our newspapers?
Well, I mean, the thing is, how do you report on something that doesn't exist?
No,
That's the issue.
to say that there is absolutely no information going up to or down from the premier of their world's largest economy. It's pretty
To
important.
lift the skirt a little bit, China is awful at cyber defense, cryptography. They have a pretty good hacking system, but they're not very good at defending it. That's because they want people to hack their own population easily.
Right.
And so when people hack, like the Politburo, discover there's nothing going on.
Right, right, right. Interesting. Very interesting. That does sound pretty reliable. I mean, that sounds pretty dispositive. All right, Vivek, you had one more question you wanted to ask.
Yeah, actually, I completely agree with you on the Iraq question, Peter. My question was like more directed towards the investments in Saudi Arabia and Oman, but I think you've answered.
The
You've
Chinese
answered
investment in those two countries are more legitimate and based on actual economic. That political influence doesn't come from that. But whenever you're building a hard asset that metabolizes a pre-existing hard asset, there's less fluff there.
And if you see the trend of FDI, the reverse FDI, if one might call it, from, or say, funds like ADNOC or some of the Saudi funds that are going into China right now, that's in the last 8 to 9 months,
That is real as well. Yeah,
Looks very
remember what the
interesting.
Saudis are doing here. The Saudis are, from a military point of view, breathtakingly and so their military strategy going back to the 60s has been, we will buy a lot of American equipment. We will shrink rapid, we will put in air-conditioned warehouses, pay Americans to come in and maintain every couple of years. If there's a military conflict, then the Americans will just fly over here, get in the equipment, and fight our war for us. Now, argue about how realistic that was, but that was the strategy. Now that the Americans are pulling back, they're finding people like MBS incredibly distasteful. The Saudis are realizing energy dependency gone. They may well need a different security guarantor. There aren't a lot of options. I mean, you got the French and the Brits who they'd really rather not. They see that as like America light. You've got the Turks, but until the Turks conquer Iraq, it's too far away. You've got the Japanese who might in the long run be the best option because they actually do have projection capacity. But to say that Japanese are gun shy about putting boots on the ground in the Middle East is an understatement. They've got China. While China doesn't have the military capacity to reach the region, they, at least from a propaganda point of view, have the ambition, and they certainly have the need for Saudi oil. So you start with what you know. Do what you can to build up that economic connection from the Saudi side in order to bait in potential security guarantor in the long run. Not saying it's going to work. I'm saying that the options are thin and poor. This is
And they
When
must.
we were at the point, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Excuse me.
So when we are at the point when Saudi's GDP has come down, oil GDP or the oil component, the GDP is down to 50% of total GDP. I mean, there's substantial changes happening, and where's the money that they need for investment, which there's some horrendous figures floating out there. Where's that going to come from if it's not China?
no one's going to invest in the Saudi economy in anything that is not energy adjacent. So the smart play for the Saudis in the midterm is to build out, for example, petrol refining, and they've been working for a while.
David, you got. Sorry. excuse me.
My next, sorry, I keep interrupting.
No, go ahead.
All right, my next question was actually, it's something that's been talked about. I think it's titillating, but it's not really, there isn't substantial evidence beyond the anecdotal, at least I haven't seen it. China's investment in Russia. There's enough to indicate that it can do more, not enough to substantially entwine the two economies. So what's China's long-term game here, and what will Russia make of China's investment long-term?
China
Because
wants to suck out every molecule of resources from Russia as long as that is physically possible. And they would like to see the Ukraine war drag on into a long-run stalemate that occupies the United States and the West, occupies the Russians for this foreseeable future. And so to that end, they're helping them with their manufacturing facilities. And to that end, every time the Russians say they will need more cash, the Chinese are basically, how about we take a share in this oil field exchange? It's a purely exploitive relationship. It doesn't make it unstable, but it's very, very one way.
Is there is the
There's
amount.
a story today. Sorry again. There's a story today. I haven't been able to confirm it. That Nornickel's closing down its plant in Russia and is moving to China. I
North
don't know how
nickel.
far it's true.
I've seen that one, and I find that hard to believe, considering that North nickel produces the nickel in Russia.
Yeah, it does, which is why I found it out to be too. I was just wondering.
Yeah. There's another layer to that we're not seeing, or it's wrong.
That's what I thought too. Thank you. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Is the economic benefit that accrues to China from turning Russia into its personal gas station more or less than what it could have by trading with Europe in the way that they initially thought they were going to?
The trade with Russia and the trade with Europe are two very different things. Europe is the terminal market for goods that the Chinese have metabolized and finished and exported. Russia is the source for the raw materials. It's not that they don't send finished goods to Russia. They certainly do, but the market is order too smaller for that.
No, I mean, in terms of net economic benefit, does it make more sense to them to think, okay, we'll perhaps not be quite so intimately friendly with Russia, and maybe we'll
Well, again, it's different. The Chinese need both. Without
Yeah.
the Russian raw materials, they can't make the products to export to China. And since there's no consumption
Right.
at home, that throughput is the only good the Chinese have.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. David, you got your hand up.
Hi, Peter. A few weeks ago during one of your walk-in talks, you brought up this, in your typical magisterial style, this presentation about the U.S. perhaps unintentionally backing into, well, with this floating restaurant off of Gaza, backing into
Restaurant.
more what I'm talking
Go
about.
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
That the U.S. was going to change unintentionally or wittingly, and that's the part I was a little sketchy on. I couldn't figure out which way you were going.
Neither
But
can they.
yes, change the dynamics completely in the Middle East, up and down, left and right, diagonally, everything. Can you comment and update?
Sure.
Oh, and
So
can I add to that
decisions.
question? Can I add to that question? Because you also said something else that I wanted that's related. You were saying that building roads to build the wall in the South was going to result in there being this huge influx of illegal immigration, right?
Oh yeah, Donald Trump is going to go down as the most pro-illegal migrant president in American history because he's the greatest natural barrier in the North American continent is the Chihuahuan and the Sonoran deserts. By building a road, 50 construction roads to build the wall, basically obviated half of the barrier.
You see why I connected the questions? Is it the
Yeah,
same?
sure.
Yeah.
Now, on the case of Gaza, to be honest, no one liked Netanyahu at all. He's kind of a jerk, and he started to make some really problematic security decisions, not just for Israel and the wider region, but for the United States. And against that backdrop, we have been edging away from the Middle East for a while, for the last presidents. The situation in is gone. The situation down in Iraq is purely token presence. We still have a very few hundred folks running around in Syria, but we're starting to understand the biggest impact that they're having is keeping the Assad regime in power. And that's not why they're supposed to be there. And if all that's left of the relationship is Saudi Arabia killing journalists, partnering with the Chinese, and Israel, perhaps a certain amount of justification carrying borderline genocidal policies in Gaza, the Americans are in the mood to figure out how to just get this. And say what you will about the Biden administration, dude knows how to pull off a scab. Otherwise, we'd still be in Afghanistan. So if you are building something off the coast of Gaza that was the single largest investment in Gaza ever, in order to specifically bypass Israeli security blockades that prevent humanitarian get in, you're talking about that relationship, the Israeli-American relationship, suddenly being weaker than it's been more. The Biden administration has made a decision one way or another, and the Iranian attack and the Israeli response have actually probably brought us a little bit closer to the Israelis in the short run. But the idea of just getting out is a powerful one. The question is whether or not there's any thought going on as to what happens the next day. And again, Biden administration has made a lot of mistakes in a lot of ways, but they haven't approached any foreign policy issue with the naivete of a neophyte, Obama or Trump.
Mhm.
And so this is a serious consideration. Don't have a prediction of how it's going to shape.
But so they're doing it willfully and intentionally.
Everything they're doing with the dock and access, yes, really intentionally. There's a cognizance that this opens up a potential path for just leaving the region completely. Doesn't mean they have to take it.
Thank
I'm
you.
not sure I understand exactly why the dock would be so transformative.
For the Israelis, it is transformed because now you're going to have an American run system deliberately bypasses Israeli security concerns and is providing 1/3 of the food for Gaza.
Well,
They did not want this thing.
they were willing to allow Qatar to provide aid for Gaza, and I don't think they would distrust the Americans the way they do UNRWA or something like that, right?
Oh, fair.
Mhm.
But the Qatari aid is all coming in through checkpoints that the Israelis control, and they control the distribution system. This is about making a new access point that
Right.
isn't Israeli territory. And even if the Americans had no intention of stabbing the Israelis in the back, if I was Israeli, I would still be a little nervous about this because this is something.
Do you think this is just meant to gain leverage, saying if you're not more forthcoming about this, we're going to do this?
Absolutely is to maintain leverage, and that also has the Israelis upset.
Yeah.
And how they respond to that leverage, whether it's used or not, to shape American actions.
Right.
Let me jump in here real quickly. One of the things you mentioned in that walk and talk, Peter, is that it's not like the U.S. will build this floating restaurant, to go back to the analogy or metaphor, and it'll just be there, and then there will be food there. But the U.S. will have to create a whole network of infrastructure, roads leading up to it, to build it, to supply it, everything else. And it's going over Israeli territory.
Right. So the potential here for clashes between the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Palestinians and the Americans and the Israelis is
That it requires roads over Israel. I thought this was something that they could do.
No. It's the floating dock about midway down the coast in Gaza.
Right.
And then there's going to be another floating dock offshore. So the big container ships come into the floating dock offshore. They unload. Ferries take stuff back and forth to the dock that's onshore of distribution.
And how do we build
international waters?
I'm sorry?
It'll be in international waters?
Well, it's in Gaza's waters, and it's a gray area.
Oh, interesting.
But do they build this thing from a ship, or do they have to be on land?
They build it from a ship.
So, what are the odds that some Gazan hothead decides that's a great terrorist target?
It's entirely possible that'll happen. And like I said, this is opening up Pandora's box for potential conflicts among all of the groups. And so it puts Israel in the awkward possession of having to provide security for a people they're not thrilled with and for a project they're opposed to. Otherwise, it all blows back on. They are not happy with this.
Wow. I wonder, do you think that this is just one of those things that Biden said without really thinking it through?
Oh, no, I think he thought it through very well. It's a very clever ploy. It forces Israeli to change its position on things American and Gazan against their will. If they don't change, it's worse for them.
Right.
It was really fucking clever.
Ken, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. I've heard you talk about some of this before. It appears to me that a lot of countries in the West, in particular Germany, the UK, Australia, and to some extent the US, are sort of in the process of committing energy suicide and reducing their energy output, electricity in particular, and making it more expensive. And that's impacting, I know a lot of industrial companies kind of trying to get out of Germany because of that. How does that impact all of this stuff with the demographics?
Well, let's start with Germany because it's a very special case.
Mm.
The German Greens have made the decision that power. It was bad, is bad, has always been bad. And even if it means we have sharp increases of carbon, we still need to get rid of them. It's one of the Russians' favorite disinformation campaigns, and it's been broadly successful. And yes, that is a big problem for one of the big problems for German manufacturing moving forward. By itself, it's not a death blow because the German system has been so efficient. But you add that into the lack of natural gas out of Russia, you add that into rising trade protectionism. And it's part of the cocktail of why I don't think the Germans are going to have much of an industrial economy. The United States, I'm not worried about. Electricity in the United States is largely a local and a regional phenomenon. Our problem is transmitting electricity among jurisdictions because of the degree. You have to get approval not just from the partners in play, but especially across a state line. You're just dealing with such a regulatory morass. And the decision was made, the FERC, they've got a regulation in place that was designed to shield the consumers who ultimately have to pay for any industrial build out. In doing so, basically everyone gets power. And so we do definitely have a clogging in the system, whether you're trying to build a nuclear power plant, a turbine, or especially any sort of transmission system. And if you're going to do anything with large generation or distributed generation, you have to have a huge transmission component. So that regulation has unfortunately had the net effect of crushing any sort of electrical build out in a small state. So what you're describing is true for the Northeast and to a slightly lesser degree for the upper Midwest. But it's not true for Texas. It's not true for California. It's broadly not true for the Midwest. And the Southeast, where Southern Company is the superpower, and basically are in bed with all the regulators in all the states, they're okay down there too. So it really is a regional phenomenon.
Okay.
That said, if the Chinese go the direction I think they're going to go, if the Germans go the direction, we need about 50% more electricity in the United States before you consider the green transition. So everything that you put your finger on is now a perennial issue until we basically quit.
The question that's really been on my mind a lot recently. Did you happen to see Phillips O'Brien's article in The Atlantic, I think it was published a day ago or 2 days ago, arguing that the U.S. is doing everything in its power to teach the world that it must acquire nuclear weapons, or to teach individual countries that they must?
I didn't see that article, but I don't have much of a problem with the core thesis.
Right.
The
It's my
whole
core.
idea is that the United States will provide security for everyone, and therefore you need a Navy and you need nukes. That has been our position until very recently. And as if the U.S. is going to back up, then everyone is going to need navies and
Yeah, that's the way I see things too. I think we're headed toward a period of wild nuclear proliferation, and this cannot end well. It just can't.
just keep in mind that the countries that are going to feel they need nukes are the ones who feel they can't win a conventional war. In Cold War, we thought about that as Iran, North Korea, China. Now we need to think of that as Taiwan, South Korea, Poland, Germany, Sweden, Finland, Saudi Arabia.
Estonia, Latvia, they all, I mean, maybe they'll have a,
I mean, I don't know if Estonia has the capacity for that, but the desire.
sure. Scott, do you have any thoughts about whether Estonia has the capacity for that? You still there, Scott? Okay.
Yeah, I know I'm here. Not on Estonia, but
Oh,
I'm
yeah,
at-
Scott, this is
I'm online. We are building a modular nuclear reactor. It's in the process of taking place, but I don't think it'll provide fissionable materials for us. We need Finland's help.
Hey, fusion, are we going to get any energy from
Finland is one of the countries that could do this quickly if it chose to.
that? Sorry, I interrupted. I just got excited for a second. You think we're going to get any interesting energy from fusion anytime soon?
There are 3 challenges.
Mm.
You need amazing transmission, long-range transmission. Superconductors that work don't have prototype. We have a theoretical prototype. So minimum 10 years out. Miniaturization. All of the fusion technology, current idea would basically be a facility about the size of Minneapolis. And you need to get it down to at least the size of Omaha. So that. We don't have a prototype for that. That's 10 years off minimum. Third, you need a self-sustaining endothermic relationship or thermic reaction. We just got that last year. Now, we haven't been able to large scale, but that might only be 5 years away. So best case scenario, we can now start to think about having an actual fusion reactor in 2050. Keep in mind, people have been saying we're only 30 years away from fusion. Been saying that for 50 years now.
Well, that's what they said about artificial intelligence too, and they suddenly did it. Speaking of
Yeah,
which,
that's not. I would argue it hasn't gone nearly as well as some of the hype is, and we're
oh,
not
do tell.
able to. Well, it's just I don't mean to suggest it's not a potential breakthrough, and it's really interesting. It is, but at the moment, doesn't look much more sexy than what we went through in the late '80s and throughout the '90s with the first information revolution. Don't get me wrong, this is still a win. If you can have 3% growth year on year for 15 years, that's a huge win. It's not fundamentally transformative. The other problem is that you have
Not
to
fundamentally
use
transformative?
chips. I'm sorry?
Not fundamentally transformative? You don't think that what they've been doing in the last couple of years with the LLMs is fundamentally transformative?
Not yet. I think it's promising. I think we should watch it, but we're not there yet.
Right.
Second, we're going to have more time to think. All of the chips that run these AI models are 3 nanometer and smaller. 90% of those come from one Taiwan.
Right.
Without globalization, those towns in Taiwan can't make those chips. So we're going to have to rebuild the entire production system for semiconductors, and that's a 10-year process.
You think it's going to be that soon? They're not going to be able to build those chips.
Yeah.
When would you predict it's going to
Within
happen?
3 years.
That's bad.
Now, I don't mean to suggest it's hopeless. There's new technology on the scene, type of lithography that may be able to be a little simpler. We're still exploring here of how complicated it is, but the existing lithography, the existing semiconductor supply chain and stuff, there's 4,500 involved, only make one product for one end user.
Right.
And they have no competition. And if you lose just a few of them, you can't win the fights.
Maybe we shouldn't deglobalize.
Well, that would we're about 42 years too late.
Taiwan. Do you think China's going to try to invade?
I'd say even odds, no. That doesn't get them anything. If they were able to conquer Taiwan with a minimum of violence and capture the fab facilities intact, they still don't get anything. They can't operate those fab facilities because the Taiwanese can't operate them on their own. China can't operate its own back home. They're certainly not going to be able to keep the quantum leap up and do what's basically take the global village. All the designs come from somewhere else. But more importantly, if they do decide to break that seal and launch a war, someone's put a few destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin. They're going to cut the energy line. They're going to cut the food line, and China will collapse in under 2 years.
Yeah, that's your theory. How do you account for the hysteria about China in the United States? Is it completely psychological?
Well, number one, Americans are never happy unless they're stressed out about something. That's us. But when you have a one-man show and a lot of propaganda, and Americans have lost capacity to do kind of like a values judgment when it comes to facts and figures, blow a lot of things out of proportion.
You know what Elbridge Colby has been running around telling people that it's insane to be wasting all these arms in Ukraine because we really need to be sending them to Taiwan. Have you followed that at all?
I have, and I don't buy it. I mean, if
I don't
we
either.
really are worried about a hot war in Taiwan, we're perfectly capable of doing both, because one of them is a relatively low-tech arm transfer, and the other one is a air-sea battle.
What's both the U.S. and the Europe's defense production base? Why aren't we able to make enough ammunition? Why aren't we?
We didn't for 30 years. In the case of Europe, they declared history over, and so why would defense ministry? In fact, until Ukraine war happened, the defense minister of this current government in Germany, remember what her name was, but she was appointed just before the war, and her express goal was to eliminate the defense ministry.
Not what's her name? Ursula, right?
No.
She was the defense minister, wasn't she?
Yeah, that was all. can't remember this woman's name. She was only there for a year. She was brought in to basically eliminate the defense industry. And then the Ukraine war happened, and she was clearly not the right person to oversee a defense overhaul. So
Andre
they
is
replaced it
nodding.
with someone who's more appropriate.
Right, right.
In the case of the United States, so the Europeans, 30 years dialing back, and now they have to ramp from a very low base. In the case of the United States, we had 30 years of war on terror. And so we prepared for a very different sort of fight. So we had the high-tech stuff, because that's what we do well. We had a low-tech occupation force. So things like artillery is things that practice for a generation. And so now we're rebuilding that capacity because that's what it's appropriate to elect for.
Is it because this stuff is so much more sophisticated than the armaments we used in the Second World War that it takes so much longer to get up to speed?
Yes
Or-
and no. When you're talking about things like the F-35, definitely it's a little like a shadow of what's going on in semiconductors, that there's so many pieces from so many places and it's so complex, so few people can do it. But in terms of artillery, it's an industrial build. You don't want to build 1 million artillery shells a month if you're only using 10,000 artillery shells a year.
Why not? Do
And
they go bad? They do? Oh, okay. I guess that does make sense then.
Yeah, watch some of the bloggers who are watching Ukraine war really close. Every once in a while, you'll see a video of an artillery piece that explodes from the inside because it has a 50-year-old North Korean shell in it.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
explosives get a little funky.
Still, why isn't there at least some effort in Europe anyway to
There is.
a
There is.
full
It's happening.
court on
It's
artillery?
happening from almost zero.
Well, we went from 0 to 60 pretty fast in the Second World War, right? I'm just trying to understand the complete difference in how long it took then and how long it's taking now.
Well, if you remember back to World War II, one country went from 0 to 60 before all the others and almost ended up ruling all of Europe.
Yes, yes.
Timing matters. So it's like I've been saying, every day that China doesn't dissolve is a gift. It gives us a day to industrialize out, to prepare for a post-China world. Every day that Russia doesn't conquer Ukraine is a gift because it gives us a day to build an industrial plant to prepare for the next fight.
But
We
where
can
is
all
the
argue that we need to-
emergency program to do this?
They are happening, but they're not happening with a panic. And maybe they should. That's a policy question, and that's a debate question.
It would
But
also be a nice deterrent if we did it very loudly.
I agree. But to say it's not happening is not fair. It's just not happening fast enough.
So when iPhone 3 reminded us the U.S. started ramping up 2 to 3 years before we entered World War II, that's true. 2 to 3 years. We're not
But
talking
not
7 years.
at the frenetic pace that we did once. And did you say iPhone 3?
That's apparently this
That
gentleman.
thing still works?
Vivek, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm going to take Peter back to the South China Sea and Philippines. There's a lot of nonsense going on there.
The position of the Chinese is to try to peel off the littoral states from one another, and especially from the United States, because in a one-on-one fight, the Chinese will always win. And so the challenge for the littoral states is to make sure that their political coalitions at home can functionally partner with the United States and Japan for the duration. And Philippines is perceived by the Chinese as the weak point in that chain because they have the most dynamic political system. And so all of the cons of democracy come into play when talking about alliance politics, because for various reasons, there are factions within the political society of the Philippines that are a little bit less enthusiastic about all things Japanese or American. So that's where the Chinese are focusing. And unless and until the Americans actually have a reopening of something like Subic, that's the logical place for the Chinese to put pressure.
But then that's probably boomeranged a bit with Japan getting interested there, all the joint exercises, meetings that have happened in the last couple of
Yeah,
weeks.
there's a lot of moving parts, but from the Chinese, this is still the Taiwan's a lock. Indonesia's too far away. Vietnam's a lock. Honestly, a really tough nut to crack. Palestine, excuse me. The Philippines, that's where there's enough in play that they think they might be able to make a crack in the system.
Then Sorry, Blake, go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead.
All right, then that brings me to another question, because there's this whole note that the IMF brought out about connector economies. So with Vietnam,
What kind of economies?
connector economies, as they call them, where China ships out some of its production or intermediate goods assemblies, some of the things out to these economies. They've done that with Mexico. Incidentally, a lot of Mexican exports into the U.S. player are Chinese. So how do you see that happening in Southeast Asia? How
It's
do
a
you see these
question of how
connectors?
fast can the Southeast Asians ramp up an indigenous industrial plant to actually manufacture rather than assemble.
Well,
Some of that going on both sides. You've got the Vietnamese in particular, both building out their industrial plant and bringing in Chinese components to assemble to get around tariffs. The more of the former, the better the relationship with the United States will be. But again, it doesn't dissolve as a gift because it gives us one more day to build out the industrial plant in other places.
Peter, I am so
thank you.
impressed. I'm so impressed. We have thrown questions about everything at you. Every single answer, and this is so rare, every single answer has been knowledgeable, no bullshit, completely not no, really. I mean, I have an extremely acute bullshit detector, but every answer has been substantive, and whether it's correct or not, we can debate because we'll have to look stuff up afterwards. But it's been substantive and thoughtful, and that's just a really impressive performance. It's virtuoso. Timothy, you got your hand up.
I go here in a few minutes, so we're like two more.
Oh, okay. Timothy, quick question.
Yeah, I just wanted to do you think is energy as important as we've been making it out?
Oh, yeah.
Because I just to give two examples, France has a lot of nuclear power. Illinois has a lot of nuclear power in the U.S., and yet those are not necessarily the most favorite states areas for new investment. They have both Illinois and France have a reputation for being very high tax, very high labor costs. You see, the new factories aren't necessarily moving to those places. They're moving to Poland, Texas, Arizona, even though both Illinois and France do have this long.
Sure. Energy is absolutely critical. Doesn't have to be nuclear. There's two components. Number one, liquids. Liquids are the transport fuel of the present, and they're the transport fuel of the near future, as well as the feedstock for all of the chemicals and chemicals that go into base manufacturing. Even if the green transition is perfectly ready to take over everything, that wouldn't change that last piece. Going anywhere, and if you don't have that stuff in some form, you just can't play. Second, as the West in general and the United States in specific really go through this huge industrial build out, the amount of electricity that we're going to need to do it is going to be massive. So if you can't get that right, can't attempt to do any of the rest of it. Illinois' problem is a policy problem. It's not a new problem. Even if Illinois does not fix anything, would still see its industrial building up by at least a third over the next 15 years, simply because there's so much we need to do. It's not what I would consider the hot pot part for expansion. That's going to be more like Denver and Arizona through Texas and the South and up to roughly Richmond. I think that's the area that can see a more than a doubling. But even in the places that don't double, you're still talking about a record build out.
Do you think we're going to get over our insane aversion to nuclear power and reduce some of the regulatory problems that have kept us from building plants?
Not in the next 10 years. Even if all the regulatory issues were solved and Congress passed everything we needed to do for disposition and build out and cross-border power transfers and all of that tomorrow, it would then take 10 years to build out the mass manufacturer to build a fleet, and then another 10 years to build the fleet. So from the point that we decide we're serious about it, you're looking at 25 years before we meaningfully increase our volume of electricity. Keep in mind, with a couple of exceptions, nuclear power plant in is more than 40 years old. We're all going offline during that build out.
Oh, I missed something there. You said it would take 10 years to build it, and then you said 25 years. What's the other 15 years?
Well, 10 years to build out the mass manufacturing so you can then build the plants.
Right. But we're going to need that in 25 years, right? Might as well stop.
I would argue there's never too late to start to add power to the grid, but nuclear is not how we're going to fix this for the current generation.
Jeff, you just showed up, but you must have got the time difference confused because we're just finishing up here. Did you have a super urgent question? I feel bad for him. I know he really wanted to hear this. All right. They're connecting to audio. We'll just give him a second here. But does anyone have an urgent question? Because if not, I'm going to ask more questions of my own.
Well,
Feel free.
one more. I got to go.
All right.
Call in 5
Jeff,
minutes.
Jeff, what's your question? Hi, Jeff.
Oh, I don't have a question.
Oh, no? Okay. All right. I want to be like you, Peter. I want to be able to do what you do. I'm just so impressed by the breadth of the knowledge and the seriousness of it. Where would you focus if you wanted to be more like you?
Well, I was a double major. That's where you start. International relations and chemistry, because until you have a broad breadth, you're going to, by default, stove yourself. And as soon as you do that, I was a generalist at my first big job. That's one of the reasons why all the analysts kept getting energy studies and their Middle East studies and vice versa.
Yeah, I'll bet. All right, we will let you go regretfully. That was just wonderful. You deserve every bit of your success.
It's been a weird year. Good.
Well,
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
well, we will all buy your new book, as soon as it comes out. When's the next one coming out?
Oh, well, I mean, you guys know about this one, right?
Yeah, of course.
This is the only one for now. I am not currently enmeshed in another writing project.
Wait, hold on a moment. That's your first one, right? The Accidental Super.
Well, this is the 10-year anniversary version. It has about
Oh,
an
I
extra
see.
100,000 words.
Oh, I guess I didn't know about that. No, okay. Well, good thing you told me. Well, I'll have to.
It has a bunch more words. Basically, it updates all the forecasts for what's been done in the last 10 years.
I leave very,
It's
very.
time for the- So maybe it's time to write a thriller with Jack Carr.
There are conversations.
Yes, you'll make a great Tom Clancy.
I have never done anything like that, so I don't want to get anyone's hopes up, but there are conversations.
Right, I'll bet. All right, thank you so much. Really grateful to you. It's fascinating conversation, and I assume no one has a problem if I post this, right? No one said anything confidential.
All right, everybody take care. I gotta go.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great lunch.